Okay, so now you know the word extirpated. I want to kind of play a little game, and normally I would play this in class. Um, but I want you to think about whether or not you think each of the species I show you is extirpated from Louisiana. So that means that it still exists somewhere in its native range, but it used to live in Louisiana and no longer does. So first up, I'm sure most of you can recognize this species. This is the American bison. Do you think that it's extirpated from Louisiana or not? So the answer is actually yes. So this map shows the historic range of the bison. So all this kind of tan color is the historic range of the American bison. And by 1870, they were restricted to this darker brown color. And by 1889, they were restricted to these pockets in green. And they almost went extinct. But the remaining bison were rounded up and put together into herds to save the American bison from extinction. And you can see that over here, this is the current range. Each of these dots are current locations where bison live, and all of these places are fenced-in areas. And so you can see here, this is Wichita National Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma. This is the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve owned by the Nature Conservancy. And over here in Kentucky, this is Land Between the Lakes, near where I went to school at Murray State University, where they have a fenced-in bison population. Because they're fenced in, they have to be highly closely regulated. All right, so next up, think about whether you know what this species is. If you said elk, you're correct. Do you think that elk have been extirpated from Louisiana? Yes or no? And normally I would play this game in class with people, have a group raise their hands for yes and raise their hands for no. But you can play it by yourself, and you don't have to worry about anybody seeing whether or not you got the right or wrong answer. So this shows the historic range of eastern elk. And the answer is yes, they did used to occur in Louisiana. You can see right here, this portion had eastern elk in it historically. And they are gone from most of this area. There are a couple of reintroduced pockets. There's one in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park over here, and they have recently been reintroduced to a place in Missouri. And that Land Between the Lakes that has the bison also has elk around here in Kentucky. So, what species is this? Obviously a bear, but it's a grizzly bear. Do you think that's been extirpated from Louisiana? Yes or no? The answer is actually no, because grizzly bears never lived historically in Louisiana. They're more of a western species, unlike bison and elk that used to live more widespread across both the east and western parts of the United States. And you can see, however, that grizzly bears have been extirpated from a large portion of their range. So they used to exist in neighboring Texas. They used to exist in Oklahoma. And you can see the current range now is dramatically restricted, mostly including Canada and Alaska. They do make it into Washington State, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. So what species is this? Hopefully everybody knows the answer to this one. It's the black bear. And do you think it's been extirpated from Louisiana? And I know some of you will definitely know the right answer to this one. The answer is actually no, because they still live in Louisiana. However, their range is dramatically contracted. So you can see here, this is the historic range, which includes almost all of the continental United States, and also going into Alaska. And you can see that in the eastern United States and the central United States, most of the populations have been extirpated. So many states can say that black bears are extirpated. Some of these bears in the eastern United States have been reintroduced. For example, the populations in Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, that is a reintroduced population. However, Louisiana remarkably never lost its black bears. And some of you probably also know that the teddy bear, named for Teddy Roosevelt, came from a bear in Louisiana. So that is the Louisiana black bear. And if you drive east from Monroe, some of you may have seen the bear crossing signs on I-20. Those are real. There are actually bears near that area. They aren't necessarily often right along the highway because there are some very large agricultural fields there, but there are populations both north and south of the interstate there, and so occasionally the bears do cross the road. All right, does anybody know who this is? This one might be harder. This is a red wolf. I may have mentioned it earlier in the lectures. And do you think they've been extirpated from Louisiana? The answer is actually yes. So the gray wolf is more of a western species. The red wolf is extremely endangered, one of the most endangered species in the United States. And it used to live all across the eastern and a large part of the central United States. They currently only live right here in North Carolina at Poquoson Lakes National Wildlife Refuge and Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, which is where I used to work right out of college. I was an intern at Poquoson Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, and I used to have red wolves in my garage and even in my house where I lived on the refuge property. I didn't actually work with the wolves, I worked with swans, but these wolves are being actively managed for their conservation. However, it is an extreme uphill battle because they interbreed with coyotes, and so they have to manage it very, very carefully. The source population for reintroducing them to North Carolina actually came from Louisiana. All the wolves that were in this place were rounded up and put on small barrier islands or into captive rearing facilities. So there are lots of zoos and nature centers that have some red wolves, and they manage them closely for breeding to make sure this species doesn't go extinct. They have a very bad rap, though, unfortunately, in eastern North Carolina. And so some of them have been shot by local landowners who claimed they couldn't tell the difference between a red wolf and a coyote. But it seems likely that some of them at least were shot on purpose because of a lot of farmers just don't like wolves. All right, what about this species? Lots of names for it: cougar, mountain lion, puma. Do you think it's been extirpated from Louisiana? The answer is actually yes. So the orange, the areas that are covered in both orange and red include the historic population, which you can see it's one of the largest geographic ranges of any vertebrate. Used to include both most of North America and all of South America. You can see that they've been extirpated from most of the eastern and central United States. Some of you, particularly people that study wildlife biology, may say, oh, but we've seen mountain lions in some states. I think there are even occasionally records from Louisiana. But there aren't breeding populations, as far as anyone knows, in these orange areas. they have found ranging males, and they can move very far distances. So when I lived in Missouri, there were occasionally reports where one would have been hit by a car, for example, in Kansas City. That has happened a few times, but they were almost always young males that were probably looking for new home ranges, and they're not known to be any breeding population. So it is a possible that one would show up in Louisiana every once in a while, but there aren't any breeding populations. You'll notice there is this one red blip down in Florida. That's the Florida panther, which is a subspecies of the mountain lion, and it's being actively managed for its conservation. So, who's extinct, who's not? So, we just went through kind of a better idea of what large wildlife used to live in Louisiana, what's still here, what's missing, and a couple of species that didn't live here in the past. And I think it would be incredible to think of what it would be like to have all of those species still in Louisiana. Can you imagine how life might be different if we had free-ranging bison and grizzly bears and wolves and mountain lions? It would be an elk. It would be very different. And there are some people that want to bring these species back to be free-ranging across the United States. We've developed a lot of it, so it's not really clear that the habitat is there, but that's definitely a conservation biology and societal question that's pretty important. So, who's extinct, who's not? Less than 30% of the world's species have been formally described. So certainly there are things that have gone extinct that we didn't even know existed. And so that's an important thing to think about when we talk about extinctions as well, that we've likely lost some things that we never knew were there. For known species, I mentioned before, it can be very difficult to determine if and when something is extinct. Many species are small and difficult to observe. And so if they're cryptic, they live underground, they're small, they look like something else, it can take a lot of effort to actually survey that species. And it's difficult to know for sure that something doesn't exist, which I said before. So just as species thought to be extinct are sometimes found alive, many species have not yet officially been designated as extinct, but probably already are. So I said it takes a lot of surveys to be sure something is extinct, and they don't really want to declare something extinct and then have it pop up the next year and go, oh, just kidding. They want some scientific rigor to designating something extinct. Now, this is another important term, extant. If you see that word, that means that it's still alive. So it's kind of the opposite of extinct. If it's extant, it's not extinct. So these are some examples. The Chinese river dolphin hasn't been seen for a long time. It is very likely extinct. These are some other examples. If a species is found to be hanging on with a few individuals in a remaining patch of habitat, it may still be doomed to extinction. There may not be enough individuals to generate enough offspring to really keep the species going in the long term. Sometimes you'll find populations that only have old individuals and there are no new individuals. And without those new individuals, the species may be doomed to extinction. So an example is the Pinta Island tortoise. Often the last individual of a species is given a name. So this was Lonesome George. This is Tuffy, the Rabb's fringe-limbed tree frog that died a few years ago, and it was the last known member of its species. And so these two species are almost certainly extinct at this point. And this is an extreme example. where the species isn't extinct yet and a single individual remains. In these two cases, they have since gone extinct, but for a little while, they were the only members left of their species.